Today, I have a story of the National Guard being used against the American people on U.S. soil in an incident that left 25 people dead, including women and 11 children. It then sparked another 10 days of violent riots that destroyed businesses and took even more lives. But the Ludlow Massacre was only part of a larger battle between striking coal miners, fuel companies, and the government called the Colorado Coalfield War. And, oddly enough, it involved some of the very same detectives from the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency that would later show up in West Virginia as part of the largest uprising in America since the Civil War. Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. This story is a bit of an oddball in our tales of tyranny, oppression, and the American people standing up for their freedom, in that it's not just a warning against government serving special interests, but also is one celebrated by the socialists. This time on the blue team were the mining companies, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Corporation, Rocky Mountain Fuel Company, and Victor American Fuel Company. Their cohorts in crime were the Colorado National Guard and hired private detectives. And on the red team were the striking coal miners at their tent colony outside of Ludlow, Colorado. Despite the Posse Comitatus Act, which was signed on June 18, 1878 by President Hayes, and which is supposed to limit the government's ability to use federal military personnel to enforce domestic policies within the United States, federal troops would ultimately be used to end the fighting. And in fact, state troops took part in it. Before we dive into yet another fascinating battle in American history, I need to thank Blackout Coffee Company for sponsoring this video. Blackout Coffee is a brand built on the traditional values of freedom, family, hard work, and good coffee. They've been supporters of this channel for a long time and also work directly with groups supporting your rights through their partner roasts. To get your cup today and help support the channel, go to blackoutcoffee.com/libertydoll. About 10,000 miners, at the advice of the United Mine Workers of America, or UMWA, had been on strike since September 13, 1913. They were mostly first-generation immigrants who, ironically, had been hired to replace other striking workers years earlier. The new strike began after they had attempted to unionize and one of their organizers just happened to turn up dead. They were protesting low pay, long and unregulated hours, not getting paid for all their work, poor working conditions, and the right to live, trade, and get medical care outside of the company-owned towns in the coal fields of Colorado. Many of their demands were allegedly already required by law in Colorado at the time, but weren't being enforced. Or rather, followed. John D. Rockefeller and his Colorado Fuel and Iron Company retaliated by evicting the miners and their families from the company towns. Having nowhere else to go, the miners constructed tent colonies, the largest of which housed about 1,200 strikers in Ludlow. Rockefeller and his interests hired on the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency, who attempted to solve the problem by raiding the tent colonies with rifles and Gatling guns. Tensions ran high between the armed strikers and the company-hired detectives for obvious reasons. A death toll was already racking up, but the miners didn't back down. Meanwhile, the mines weren't operational, and so business was at a halt. Rockefeller and company didn't like that much and had a special relationship with the governor, who then called out the National Guard to try and squash the strike, with Rockefeller paying their wages. At first, the people thought the Guard was there to protect them and that the government was on their side. They cheered and welcomed the Guard in with open arms. Instead, the Guards arrested them by the hundreds, beat them, and paraded the women in the streets. The Guard also escorted strikebreakers to the mines and overlooked the violent actions of the detective agency. Agents would shine searchlights on the tent villages at night and fired bullets into the tents at random, occasionally killing and maiming some people. They used an improvised armored car mounted with a machine gun that the Union called the Death Special to patrol the camp's perimeters. There were also frequent sniper attacks, which forced the miners and their families to hide in pits they dug under their tents. Confrontations between striking miners and working miners, whom the Union called scabs, sometimes also resulted in deaths, and armed battles occurred between strikers and sheriffs recently deputized to suppress the strike. This altogether was the Colorado Coalfield War of 1913 and 1914. Still, the tent cities remained all through the fall and winter. Then, on March 10, 1914, a replacement worker's body was found on the railroad tracks near Forbes, Colorado. The National Guard said that the strikers had murdered the man, and in retaliation, a general with the Guard ordered the Forbes tent colony to be destroyed. The attack was launched while the residents were attending a funeral of 2 infants who had just died a few days earlier. And this was just one of the many incidents ramping up the violence. On the morning of April 20th, 3 detectives appeared at the Ludlow camp ordering the release of a man that they claimed was being held against his will. Of course, there are varying accounts of what actually sparked the violence that followed and who shot first. Some people say that there wasn't a hostage at all. A camp leader, Louis Tikas, left to meet with Major Patrick J. Hamrock at the train station in Ludlow Village, half a mile from the colony, allegedly to discuss a truce. But while he was gone, 2 guardsmen installed a machine gun on a ridge near the camp, and when the strikers refused to hand over the hostage, or by other accounts a striker the guard was looking for, the National Guard opened fire on the camp. It started a gunfight that lasted an entire day and even saw the detectives using dynamite against the miners. 3 of the 4 strike organizers, including Tikas, were captured and killed by the National Guard. When their bodies were found, Tikas had been shot in the back. Eventually, the miners began to run out of ammo, and many fled to the hills, while others hid in their tent pits to try and avoid the gunfire. That night, the National Guard descended on what was left of the tent colony, covered it in kerosene, and set it on fire. Which is a tactic the ATF still likes to use today. 13 residents were shot and killed trying to escape the fires. Among those trying to run were the women and children who were beaten back into the flames by gunfire. During the battle, 4 women and 11 children hid in a pit beneath one of the tents where they had set up a makeshift infirmary. They were trapped when the tent above them was set on fire and collapsed. 2 of the women and all of the children suffocated and died. These deaths became a rallying cry for the United Mine Workers of America, who called the incident the Ludlow Massacre. Rockefeller, meanwhile, would later claim that there was no massacre and that the actions were taken because the National Guardsmen were desperate to protect themselves from the armed miners. He blamed the deaths of the women and children in the pit on overcrowding and poor ventilation of a tent. Once news of the massacre got out, miners in other tent cities attacked mines and their security forces in a series of riots and battles now called the 10-Day War. In the town of Trinidad, the United Mine Workers of America openly distributed guns and ammo to the striking workers. Then, on April 28th, President Woodrow Wilson dispatched the U.S. Army to Colorado, thereby ending the violence and restoring order to the region, more or less. The 1913-14 Colorado coal strike ended in December 1914, but not because of government presence, but because the UMWA ran out of money. The deaths of the women and children in the death pit captured the public imagination, as killing unarmed women and children, even if done by accident, was completely unacceptable to the American public. Therefore, despite the hostile press that striking workers had received before the massacre, media outlets attacked the mine owners with gusto. In the end, it led to congressional talks on how to prevent, or regulate, private entities from using martial power. It also led to a decline in company towns and the rules that forced workers to live, shop, and get their medical care there, though the practice would continue into the Great Depression, and there are rumors of Amazon and SpaceX reviving it in some form. 408 strikers were arrested and 332 were indicted for murder. Only 1 was convicted, which was later overturned by the Colorado Supreme Court. 22 National Guardsmen, including 10 officers, were court-martialed, while 1 lieutenant, Lieutenant Carl Linderfelt, was found responsible for the death of Tikas and other strikers with execution-style injuries. He and all other guardsmen were acquitted. That is it for today's little history lesson. I hope that you guys learned something, because I definitely did. Shout out to whoever it was in the comments, I think on Twitter, that actually suggested I look this incident up. This is one that I definitely never read about in the history books and provides another shining example of why not to trust the government. At any rate, please like, share, and subscribe if you are new here. Ring that notification bell if you want to follow along with other history videos or keep up to date in Second Amendment and Second Amendment adjacent news. And as always, thanks for tuning in, and happy shooting.